Hi, my name is Megan Blue, and I will be doing a presentation on the media in Qatar. So, why Qatar? I had the amazing opportunity to visit Qatar last year, and I was fascinated by its culture, its government, and its media while I was there. Qatar is an incredibly new country, and it has such deep roots in Middle Eastern history, but because of its absolute newness, its relationship with other Middle Eastern countries is quite tense, as I'm sure you've heard in the news, and it actually owns the predominant media in the Middle East. So I think its relationship with media transparency is very fascinating. As you can see, I've got some personal photos here to give you sort of a concept of what the culture is like in Qatar. So to your left, you see an image from inside the Museum of Islamic Art. The building itself is actually Islamic art. Those windows are symmetrical, which is a common theme in Islamic art. It's very beautiful. And what I really love is that you can see the traditional Islamic culture, and then right up through the window, you can see the incredibly modern skyline. Next to that, you see some birdhouses. Now, like I said, Qatar is incredibly new. All of the buildings there are very new, but they do have this desire to reflect their ancient roots because the land itself has been inhabited for quite a long time, so they've replicated these birdhouses that used to be part of Bedouin culture. They're really quite beautiful, and that's actually right across the street from the Al Jazeera Media Cafe that we'll talk about shortly. And then to your right, you can see a view from the beach. You can see the skyline in the background. And then on the very right of the picture, you have these yachts. Qatar is an incredibly wealthy country. It's outstanding how wealthy Qataris are. And then to the right of the picture, you see that sort of brown smudge. That's a very, very old boat, about 200 years old. So it's really fascinating to see the old and the new together there and to explore how that impacts Qatari culture. So the images that you see here are a progression of the Doha skyline. The top one is 2005, and then you see 2010 and 2013. Qatar has sort of blown up over the past decade. It's incredible how quickly they've expanded and built infrastructure. Clearly from the URL down there, this does not come from a credible source. However, I have seen these images many times. Almost any public building you go into, or even private cafes, have these images everywhere. I was stunned to find that there were no credible sources talking about the incredible pace of progress in Qatar. They've developed so quickly. So if you look, the pyramid-shaped building to the right was the only thing there in the 1970s, and now you can see the skyline in 2013. And the media has a lot to do with this. We'll talk later about the World Cup and their 2020 plan and their plan for progress and how they promote that through the media. It's an incredible case study to look at, and it's a shame that more credible sources don't talk about it so often, but we'll also get into a little bit why sources don't talk about Qatar that often outside from the recent news about the blockade. So this is just a nice view of what the skyline looks like in the evening. Again, of course, this doesn't come from a credible source, but I have seen it myself with my own eyes. And again, it's just really interesting that there's not more information out there about how beautiful Qatar is and how futuristic it is. Of course, again, like I've said, we're going to talk about controversies around Qatar that I think may contribute to this, but regardless of their political stance or anything going on in that country, it is undeniable that the skyline is potentially the most beautiful skyline in the world. It's very futuristic, very gorgeous, and again, we've talked about the wealth before. The amount of wealth that you see here is just incredible. So, like I said before, Qatar is an incredibly new country, so talking about where it came from is just absolutely fascinating. Qatar was not inhabited year-round originally. The land was used seasonally as a pearl diving spot the Qatari coast was abundant with pearls, so Bedouin tribes would travel there for a season, dive for pearls, and then travel and sell them in other locations. That was the primary and at the time only resource that was known in Qatar. Unfortunately, the pearls were overfished, and there are now, according to locals, no pearls left on the coast, which is unfortunate. But fortunately for Qatar, oil was discovered in 1939, giving them a new resource. And this is what really launched the inception of Qatar. When oil was discovered, the British, of course, colonized the area, and it established infrastructure and industry that allowed Qatar to be inhabited year-round without worry about fresh water or food or any of those resources that are very hard for more impoverished, less advanced societies to access in a desertous region. So in 1971, September 3rd, 1971, Qatar did gain independence from Britain, becoming its own independent country. The Al Thanis, who were Bedouin leaders for really no one knows how long, became the ruling class. So the Al Thanis' rise to power is absolutely fascinating. They were the leaders of the Naim Bedouin tribe, going back again who knows how long, and they were the leading tribe. There's no known reason why they were the leading tribe. Qatari legend, though, according to locals, from what I heard while I was there, the Naim Bedouin tribe was the leading tribe because they were the best camel trainers. I think that's a really fun cultural fun fact there. So the leader of the tribe in the late 19th, early 20th century, Hassim bin Mohammed bin Thani, is known as the founder of Qatar. He is called the founder, capital the, capital founder. And so what's really interesting about that is that he died in 1913, before anyone was known to be living in Qatar year-round, before the British discovered oil, and before Qatar gained independence and actually legally became a country. What's really fascinating, one of the websites in my citation that you'll see where I got this information, Qatar's cultural website, talks about the founder, and they claim on that website that he fought off the British at some point during his life. They don't say when, and that's what made Qatar a country, when he expelled the British. Interestingly enough, though, he did die in 1913, a good around 20 years before the British even entered Qatar that we know of. So I think that's really interesting to think about how factual that source is. But it is believed by Qataris. If you go to Qatar and talk to a Qatari, that is what they will tell you. So the picture that you see is also from the Museum of Islamic Art. Again, you see that beautiful symmetry. It's a stunning museum. So in order to really understand media in Qatar, you have to know how the current government works. So first thing to note, you don't see any pictures on this slide. You cannot take pictures of government buildings. You cannot see most government buildings. Actually, they're surrounded by walls, but you can't even take pictures of the walls. So I just think that's really interesting. And a fun fact for anyone who's ever watched Veep, the Museum of Islamic Art is actually the image they use for the palace in that show, because you cannot film or take pictures of the very, very tall walls surrounding the palace. So, as I mentioned, Qatar has a palace. That is because they are an absolute monarchy, led, of course, by the Al Thanis, who have been the only ruling family in Qatar's history. So the current emir is Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. So he gained power in 2013. Locally, he's known as being quite liberal, very young. His goal is to modernize Qatar, and we'll talk about some of those efforts later on. The Prime Minister, as you can see, is also an Al Thani. Actually, to work in the government, you have to be an Al Thani. Every Al Thani gets to be a government official. If you talk to non-Qataris, but locals who live in Qatar, they joke that if you're an Al Thani, you just get to pick a building and that's yours, and it doesn't matter what you do, you're part of the government. So Qataris are a minority in their own country. This is because you have to have paternal lineage to Qatari families going back to the original Bedouin tribes in order to be a Qatari citizen. There is no other way. To become naturalized, you have to live in Qatar for 20 years. They are very restrictive. Interestingly enough, though, only 250,000 of 600,000 people total are actually Qatari. They are a minority. 94% of the private workforce are actually migrants. So my dad was one of those migrants. He worked part-time in Qatar for quite a long time. That's how we got to go there. Of course, with the blockade, he does no longer work there. But almost all of the workforce that you encounter as a tourist or as a non-Qatari are not Qatari. A lot of them do come from India or East Asian countries. And interestingly enough, our waitress in a restaurant was telling us that she was recruited through college. The Qatari government sends people to colleges to recruit people to come do labor that we in the United States would see as something not requiring a college degree. So that's very interesting. And actually these private workforces keep their employees separated from Qataris. They are given work housing, and oftentimes they are not allowed to bring their families over. They are seen as very temporary, very expendable. It's just a truly interesting culture to witness and experience. And even though Qataris are a minority, they are first class above all else. In a way, there's no second class. It's first class and then bottom of the barrel. When you see Qataris interact with non-Qatari employees, it's shocking and reminiscent of times long gone in the West. So that's a really interesting aspect to think about when you think about the Qatari government and the media again. The way that they view their workers, the way that they view non-Qataris is very low. And unfortunately, I don't really have any resources. Of course, why would they document that? But I did experience some very shocking things firsthand while I was there that I think really would contribute to your understanding of how they interact with the media in that country. When you talk about media in Qatar, you have to talk about Al Jazeera. Truthfully, there's almost nothing else to talk about. Al Jazeera is so dominant in Qatar and is actually the most popular media source in the Arab world. So Al Jazeera was founded by the Qatari Emir in 1996, and its chairman is also an Al Thani. So that's really important to think about when we talk about what type of media Al Jazeera is and how transparent it is or isn't. So we've talked about the types of media there are. We've talked about government media, private media, all of that. And the really difficult thing is that Al Jazeera does not fit into any of the known categories for media. So case studies on Al Jazeera have a hard time pinpointing what it is or isn't, and that is because there is a complete lack of transparency regarding Al Jazeera. This is really interesting because according to a case study published in 2013 by Tal Samuel Azran, the public overwhelmingly sees Al Jazeera as being unbiased and trustworthy. And yet, in a way, Al Jazeera is potentially the least transparent, maybe most biased media source there is in the world because of its connection to the Qatari government. So, like I said, the Emir established Al Jazeera, and he did so by providing a very hefty loan when he established it in 1996. And the claim at that time was that was because it was a loan and the loan was expected to be paid back, Al Jazeera was a private organization. However, in 2001, the loan was extended indefinitely, so the government is funding Al Jazeera. Additionally, you talk about it being private, but an Al Thani, a member of the ruling family of Qatar, is the chairman, has been the chairman consistently. So the family is very involved with the organization. there are some very interesting claims by Al Jazeera employees that management, which would of course again be the Al-Thanis, have fed journalists stories about enemies of the state or other political issues, and that of course would be very biased, very non-transparent. However, in 2009, the Prime Minister of Qatar, again an Al-Thani, went on Al Jazeera and vehemently denied those accusations. Now again, Al Jazeera is owned by the Al-Thanis essentially. They pay for it, they run it. The Prime Minister is an Al-Thani. So there's no way to research if that is true or not. It's he said, she said, or really he said in this case. So there's no way to know for sure if the government is feeding Al Jazeera stories or not. Interestingly enough, though, Al Jazeera is never critical of Qatar and is consistently critical of states that Qatar has disagreements with. The referenced case study focused on the Qatari-Saudi crisis between 2008 and 2013, and it noted that during the crisis, negative press of Saudi Arabia did increase on Al Jazeera. Now, that could be a coincidence, so we also have to look to more radical accusations that Al Jazeera is a supporter of terrorism. So, of course, Qatar, the state itself, has also been accused of supporting terrorism, so much so that the blockade has been put in place, and Al Jazeera has really contributed to that blockade. Al Jazeera was a big promoter of the Arab Spring and is a big promoter of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is widely considered to be an extremist group by the Arab world. So the most damning thing is that Al Jazeera referred to the removal of the Brotherhood from Egypt as a coup. That statement was very controversial, and that really labeled Al Jazeera as a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood and then as a supporter of terrorism. Now, of course, there are arguments against Al Jazeera being a supporter of terrorism, most notably that in Al Jazeera's Code of Ethics on its website, it does say that it is dedicated to diverse viewpoints. But if we're going to talk about what's on the website, it's worth mentioning that there is no mention of Qatar or the Al-Thanis on the website. You go to Who We Are, there's no mention of who runs the organization. You look at Bloomberg, there's no mention of who runs the organization. The case study is the only place that I was able to find that an Al-Thani is the chairman of Al Jazeera. There is no transparency about who is actually running the organization. So when you talk about the Code of Ethics on their website and their support of diverse viewpoints, there's really no way to know that that's the case other than their website says that, but their website is not transparent about who owns them. So that's not necessarily reliable information. Of course, Al Jazeera's support of the Muslim Brotherhood does align with the fact that Qatar financially supports the Muslim Brotherhood. That really just lends itself to suggesting that the government does have more control over Al Jazeera than they let on, and that it is possible Al Jazeera really is a government-run organization. But again, by all official accounts, by public view, it's not. So it just can't fit into a precise category. It's called a hybrid by most studies, so it's really hard to place and identify what Al Jazeera is and how it works. What's really interesting here, we have a picture. So this was taken in the Al Jazeera Media Cafe in Doha. They have a little museum exhibit. I got to visit it. It's fascinating and, as an American, quite uncomfortable. The image that you see there are artifacts from an Al Jazeera journalist who was killed by Americans, allegedly, of course. So the accusation here was that Al Jazeera offices and buildings have been bombed frequently by the Americans because of Al Jazeera's connection to terrorist organizations. There's no reliable source for this other than what Al Jazeera claims there in their own building, but the claim is that the Americans would attack Al Jazeera because Al Jazeera had connections to Osama bin Laden. As you may know, they published videos, they published interviews, their journalists had access to Osama bin Laden, and the Americans and much of the world saw this as their support of terrorism because they wouldn't give him up. And Al Jazeera claims that it was journalistic integrity. And then they also claim that that's why Americans were attacking their buildings. Also, according to this museum, an Al Jazeera journalist was held in Guantanamo and then was killed there. So that's really something to think about when you think about the transparency and the intent behind their connection to terrorism, whether or not it's journalistic integrity, whether or not it's the government supporting a terrorist organization. Overall, it was a very uncomfortable experience, though. As an American, you don't see that in our media, but you do see it everywhere in their media. It's just a very different perspective to look at. So this is just an example of one of the pieces from the case study discussing the correlation between Al Jazeera's coverage of Saudi Arabia and the conflict between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So as you can see in this chart, there are records of the tone of items concerning Saudi affairs, pre-conflict, during the conflict, and post-conflict, charting the positive, negative, and neutral tones. And so as you can see during the conflict, those negative numbers are significantly higher than pre-conflict or post-conflict. And of course, again, that could be a coincidence. Al Jazeera does claim to be independent and privately owned. Qatari government claims that as well, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest the contrary. And again, that's why it's just so difficult to pinpoint what type of media Al Jazeera is. Again, there is a lot of suggestion that it is government media, but they deny that quite consistently, and yet the evidence suggests that they are. So it's such a fascinating case study. A very interesting way to look at media in Qatar currently is to talk about the upcoming 2022 World Cup. There is so much scandal surrounding this event. So, of course, Qatar has been accused of bribing FIFA for its position as the host of the World Cup. Labor conditions have been labeled extremely unsafe by human rights groups, and workers' rights are minimal to none. So it's really interesting to look at Al Jazeera's coverage of these scandals versus other news media. Worldwide news media talks about the World Cup in negative light. I found especially British media, The Guardian specifically, talks about this in a very negative light. In February, actually, a British laborer did die while on the job working on the stadium for the World Cup. So that was very big in the press then. And the coroner involved in that case has claimed that conditions are unsafe for work and that the managers of these work sites are aware of it and don't care. Additionally, they ran a story about the workers' rights, specifically coming from impoverished countries. When these migrant workers arrive, they are forced to hand over their passports. And then because they're forced to hand over their passports, getting them back is difficult to impossible. It's quite a big scandal during the earthquake in India when Indian migrants were not allowed to leave Qatar to return to their families after that event. They're considered slaves in a way. They are allegedly unpaid or underpaid, forced to work unreasonable hours. And this is all according to British media. Then you look at Al Jazeera's coverage of these scandals, and it talks about all these programs that Qatar is launching to resolve these workers' rights issues, passing laws to ensure that they are paid more. It's very light and positive coverage, so there's such a contrast between these two. And then, of course, there's the question of how the blockade will impact the World Cup. Now, Israeli media, British media, American media are all saying that the blockade could cause Qatar to lose the World Cup. Al Jazeera, on the other hand, says that this is not likely, that there's no indication from FIFA that they will lose the World Cup, and they actually published a story in which the Al Thani's did call it a smear campaign. So it's very interesting to look at the absolute contrast between coverage from Al Jazeera and other media regarding this issue. And of course, that's not to say that the other world media is not biased as well. Clearly, because of the blockade, there is some bias against Qatar. There's no way to really consider any of the sources as being unbiased. But Al Jazeera's vehement support of Qatar, when almost every other media source is being very critical, is potentially not a coincidence. It is a very strong argument that Al Jazeera, again, is not transparent, is completely biased, and is run by the government. So we've just gone over the coverage of the World Cup, and it's worth mentioning why it matters. So Qatar, of course, its resource is oil, as we've discussed before, and oil is a finite resource. The Qatari government is overwhelmingly aware of this. All of their money comes from oil, and they need that money to continue functioning. Again, Qatar does not have much by the way of natural resources or human necessities. Everything they have because they can buy it. So they need to expand industry, and something that they're focusing on is tourism. Again, I mentioned much earlier that the new emir is quite modern and liberal, and this is because he wants tourists to come to Qatar. And so the World Cup would really help boost that. They have this 2022 plan, a 2030 plan, a 2020 plan, all these plans for progress in Qatar to make it more tourist friendly, to make it an attraction, so that when the oil runs out, their income, their resources don't run out. And so when we talk about Al Jazeera giving positive coverage to the World Cup, that's not just PR. It's very important to Qatar's sustainability that the World Cup be successful, that they be successful on the world stage. This blockade, though it's not getting much press anymore, and though Al Jazeera claims that it's, not that dramatic, not that tragic, it really is very serious because Qatar does not have much to rely on other than what they can trade, and when they run out of oil, they need something else to be able to trade. And they put all their eggs in one basket for tourism. So blockade, the removal of international business, tourists not going there so much, that could have very serious consequences for them. So these are just some screenshots from items that I've referenced throughout. Wasn't room on all the slides for everything. So in the top left-hand corner, you see the Bloomberg website, company overview of Al Jazeera Media Network. You see there's no information there. It was very difficult to find any information on the web. Again, I'd encourage you to go to the Al Jazeera website. You'll see there's nothing there indicating that they are run by the Al Thani's. And then, of course, we talked about the differing news coverage of the World Cup. So you see in the top right-hand corner, The Guardian talking about the workers' rights. And then if you look to the bottom, you see Al Jazeera talking about the workers' rights. So you see the contrast in the tone regarding this. And I think it does really show a strong correlation between Al Jazeera and Qatari government influence. Alright, so I do believe I've very much gone over time at this point. There's so much to talk about when we talk about Al Jazeera and the Qatari media because, again, it's an absolute monarchy. There aren't so many of those in the world anymore, and it's an absolute monarchy that funds the primary media outlet for the Arab world. So there's so much to talk about and how a city-state works with its media and how they brand themselves with their media and how Qatar uses its media to promote its industry. There's so much to cover. We haven't even gotten to true censorship, and that's partially because that's such a difficult subject to cover, again, because there's so very little transparency surrounding Al Jazeera and Qatari media. To wrap this up, essentially, though, we're talking about the 3 types of media, those 3 categories, and we talk about which one does Qatari media fit into. And again, that 2013 study by Tal Samuel Azran, it doesn't. It's a hybrid. It's in a way polarized pluralism claiming to be liberal. I think that's the best way to describe it. You know, there's very little transparency. It's very in line with the government, but it claims to be so independent. And again, the public views it as being independent and unbiased. It's very hard to categorize Al Jazeera, Qatari media. That's because it is so unique. And again, when you look at those 3 types, it talks about newspaper circulation, it talks about the history of media in that country. And the thing is, media does not have a history in Qatar really going past 1996, you know, because it is an Islamic state, because of the very classist society in Qatar. You know, the Al Thanis run everything. Qataris own everything, and everyone else works for them, and they don't have rights. They're not citizens, so they can't vote. So it's just it's a very interesting case study. So I'm very much looking forward to your questions. And so I'll leave you with this picture. I've been talking about how wealthy Qataris are. This was taken at a buffet that I went to. And yes, that is gold leaf you see on the strawberry, on the cheesecake, and in the mango pudding at a buffet. And it was a very crowded buffet. There was a lot of gold leaf, also caviar and truffles. This is just colloquial, but you know, it's insane how much money there is in that country, so I wanted to give a brief example of that. I really enjoyed talking about Qatar in this presentation. I really love studying this country. It's so unique, so unlike any other part of the world, and talking about their media is just absolutely fascinating. So again, very much looking forward to your questions. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and the Works Cited is coming up next. Thank you so much for listening.